Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Edie's Susty Talks. You're listening to the voice of Edie's content editor, Sarah George. And if you're new to Susty Talks, these are our short but sweet one-on-one conversations with sustainability leaders from across the globe. And I'm delighted to be dialing today Michelle French, who is the Director of Global Sustainability Programs at ADM, to learn a bit more about climate smart agriculture and regenerative farming. So, Michelle, thank you so much for your time. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for hopping on. Whereabouts are you dialing in from today?
I'm in Decatur, Illinois, right in the middle of the state, surrounded by corn and soy.
Yeah, so that's probably the place to be if you're in a job like yours. So for the listeners, it'd be great to have, in your words, a little bit of an introduction to ADM and your role there.
Sure. So ADM is a global agribusiness. We source a lot of raw commodities. Corn and soy are primary, but we also do wheat, canola, peanuts, and several others. We take those crops and we either sell them whole or we transform them into ingredients that go around the world for food, feed, fiber, fuel, personal care products, and industrial products. So my role at ADM is really focused on our sustainability programs, projects, and strategy. I've been at ADM for about 13 years. So I cover everything from carbon accounting and reduction strategies all the way to human rights and our implementation programs there, our reporting aspect, how we communicate what we're doing to all of our interested stakeholders, as well as regenerative and sustainable agriculture. So really on that sourcing piece.
Great. It sounds like a super interesting role, and we could talk about any of those topics, but I'm going to focus in on the regenerative ag because I know that the past few months have been really big for ADM in that field. We've seen some new, more ambitious targets for scaling regenerative ag coming out earlier this year after uptake to date has proven really successful. So it'd be great to hear a bit more about what the targets are and how the company has successfully driven uptake at scale.
Yeah, so when we first kicked off our new branded regenerative agriculture program, which we call Regenerations, we had set a target for year one to reach 1 million acres, and we had set our 2025 target to be 4 million acres. This was based off of work to date where we'd done a number of small scale trials, projects to dip a toe in the water, kind of see farmer appetite, see where we were going. We were at about 200 to 300,000 acres of regenerative sourced commodities. And so we said, you know what, we're going to go big. We're going to set this first target. And we went out, and that first year we hit 1.2 million acres. We were really overwhelmed by how well the rollout went. We just completed year two, and we had a 2 million acre target. We wanted to grow 1 million acres, and we hit 2.8 million acres globally. And so as we look at this trajectory moving toward 2025 and the overwhelmingly positive feedback that we're getting from growers who are participating, we thought, you know what, 4 million is not ambitious enough. So we bumped that goal up to 5 million acres globally in 2025.
Yeah, it's heartening to hear that, and it would be great to hear a little bit more about how that works in practice. You've mentioned that you grow several different kinds of crops in several different places. So what does regenerative look like for different regions and different kinds of those crops?
Sure. So the first thing is that ADM does not actually own any of the farms. We don't do the farming ourselves. So this really requires us to go out and work with the growers, with the farmers in our supply chain. And so what we have started with before we kicked off and launched our programs, we did a lot of focus groups. We have longstanding relationships with farmers in our supply chains, and we sat down with them and we talked. We said, what is sustainability to you? What does that mean for your operation? And I was surprised that every one of the farmers said the same thing. For them, sustainability is being able to pass their farm on to the next generation. It was really about their legacy. And so when we developed this program, we realized we can't go to a farmer and say, hey, let's talk about your carbon emissions. Let's talk about the number of this type of microbe in your soil that represents biodiversity. It was the wrong language. And so what we decided was we need to define regenerative agriculture for ADM. We looked at a number of different programs out there. There's not one consolidated definition, but we have a definition that we're comfortable with that we use as our North Star. We have principles like keeping bare soils covered, like minimizing the disturbance, being very cognizant and thoughtful about the use of fertilizers, pesticides, any additives going in. And with those as kind of our guiding stars, we can then look very regionally specific. So we need a global set of principles, but then we do a risk assessment. If we're looking in South America, for example, you have very different pressures than what you have in right here in central Illinois. And it's still different from what we might see in Europe or in India. So we designed our program to be flexible, that it really focuses on what the farmers need and what the regional risks are. That's been huge for us. So then once we kind of had that framework set, we went out and we talked to farmers about what is motivating for you. You know, there are several farmers who are wanting to know, well, what are you going to do with this data? If I give you an insight into what I'm doing on my farm, what are you going to do with that? Who are you going to tell? Why do you need to know? So some of it is sitting down and having that conversation. Why do we need the data? Who cares? Some of it is sitting down and saying, well, here's how this can help your farm. I'm not going to talk to you in terms of metric tons of carbon dioxide, but let's talk about sustainability for you. You want to be able to leave your farm to the next generation. The health of the soil is important. That's your greatest asset. And that's usually when farmers will light up and say, yes, absolutely. Let's talk about my soil. Let's talk about how do I increase my yield? How do I make this more cost effective? And it's not just ADM coming in. So when we look at a successful program, we have three key components. One is that financial incentive, because there is risk involved, there is cost involved. So we always bring a financial component. The second piece is a data platform. So we have a data platform, we have data partners around the globe, and they help to kind of, I won't say eliminate the pain of data entry, but hopefully greatly reduce it. And then the third piece is technical assistance, because as much as I like going out and talking with a farmer and they like showing off their operation, not a single one of them wants to hear my personal thought on how they should run their farm. They have trusted advisors, they have agronomy specialists that they rely on. And so when we work with those technical assistance providers, those experts that are regionally specific, so we have technical expertise in all of the different regions, they can have the conversation with the farmer about what would be best for this soil type, what would be best for your specific crop rotation. So they get that personalized advice and education to allow them to be successful with these practices.
Yeah, that's awesome. Super great advice. And I don't doubt that things like data collection can be really painful. And that's something we hear from a lot of other folks. But I wanted to come back to something that you've mentioned there, which is that farmers see sustainability as legacy and resilience. And we've talked a bit about how regenerative farming can cut emissions, but how can it make farms more climate resilient, and what else needs to be done to protect farms against climate change and extreme weather? So I'm calling from the UK, where we've just had our wettest 18 months on record, and the data's yet to come through, but that is going to devastate a lot of farmers. So how are you working on resilience as well as mitigation?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a story. It's one of my favorites from a group of farmers that we work with in Iowa. We were kind of having a little bit of difficulty getting to the expansion of acreage in cover crops that we were hoping for. We had a couple of, I would say, pioneers who were completely sold on the idea and willing to go out, ready to do it. And they reported back that, farmers have a lot of pressure, social pressure, peer pressure from, their neighbors. And we had a gentleman who told us, they thought I was crazy. My fields look ugly because they're not tilled. It's not a nice, big, open, fresh soil that you can see. It looked like, just rubble and stubble everywhere. And then I had these green things popping up in the middle, and they all thought I was nuts. And then we had a really wet March, really wet April, and I went out in my field and I got to work with planting, and they were still flooded out of their fields. And they came to me and said, "What on earth are you doing? How come you're in your field and we still aren't?" He said, "Well, I'm doing this program. I've got these cover crops and they're really making a difference." He told us this story, and it was like, okay, that makes sense, because after that happened, all of his neighbors were calling us saying, "Hey, we want to get in on this too." We can actually see the difference that these cover crops are making. And I think that really speaks volumes to what we're trying to achieve, because there's no good metric to say you're going to increase your resiliency by XYZ. There's a lot of just experiment and experience that comes with it. When a grower actually sees, my neighbors are flooded out of their fields, but I'm still able to get in and do what I need to do. Or vice versa, when we haven't had the rain, and because of the little rivulets that the cover crop roots have made, the soil is able to absorb more moisture, and they're able to last longer in dry periods. Those are the types of stories that we hear back from the growers that are really impactful. The greatest advertising for our program comes from the growers themselves, when they can talk to each other, when they can learn from each other, and when they actually start to see that resilience in action. That's where we know that we're starting to have success, and it's more than just a theory on paper.
Yeah, I think it's human nature to want to see something in person from someone that's similar to you before you trust something new. And I wondered whether that also applies to the financial piece of this. Like you mentioned, it's a different way of doing business. You've got to think about things like upfront costs and how returns might change for a few years and then in the long term. So how do you go about communicating that to farmers, or is that a case of them seeing some case studies from their neighbors as well?
So what's interesting is when you look at a practice like a cover crop, that can range in cost from, 27 to $40 per acre. By the time you get seed and you apply it, you have to either fly it on, drive it on, whatever the different methods are. It can be pretty costly. Um, when you have a technical assistance provider who helps you choose the right seed, gets you connected with some of the different groups that have discount on seeds, we can bring that cost down to closer to $20 an acre. But then when you start seeing cash incentives coming from supply chain partners, that gets that cost down even further, and you're getting pretty close to that net zero cost piece. But the tricky part is that the yield benefits, the resiliency benefits, you might see some that first year, but often it's 3 to 5 years before you're really seeing that piece come in. And so it's a very upfront and honest conversation with the growers, that part of the reason that we're offering financial incentives is to help bridge that gap. And the next question that I always get from downstream supply chain partners is, okay, so we don't have to pay for this forever, right? Once it's making up that delta, it should be free. And what I think is really interesting is we're starting to see some very savvy farmers who now understand that the data from their farm, for transparency, for traceability, for carbon accounting reasons, is very valuable. So we're starting to see this shift from financial incentives to help get them over that starting line just to do the practices, to financial incentives to make sure that we have access to their data moving forward, and that they're partnering with us for a longer term measurement and gains over time that benefit the entire supply chain.
Great, so many learnings there from farmers. I guess I also wanted to ask about the other side of this, which is that ADM supplies commodities and ingredients to some of the world's biggest businesses. And I wanted to get your feel on whether they are demanding that you and your farmers shift to regenerative. It feels like we're at a big moment for this. So is that a signal you're seeing from customers as well?
I would say yes. We do hear a lot from big customers that are wanting us to encourage these practices. I would say it comes from kind of different angles, and it comes from different industries. So we see in the fuel space, for example, there's a big push for traceability to the field level to ensure that there's no deforestation, to ensure that we can adequately account for carbon and tie it back to a gallon of fuel. A lot of that is due to regulatory standards. We see this in the food industry where the driver isn't necessarily a regulatory scheme, but consumers are starting to be much more savvy with their shopping, wanting to know that they are supporting products and brands that have the same values. And so we see companies, depending on what they're selling, being very interested in regenerative agriculture. When you buy a loaf of bread, a consumer can very easily say bread comes from flour, comes from wheat, and they can link that back to the supply chain, to the field, to the farm, and say, okay, I understand farming practices that went into this. And so we see items like that that are very easy for a consumer in their mind to tie back to the field, to start seeing some more product level drive for those regeneratively sourced products. For products that are maybe a little bit more processed or not as easy to link back, if you think of something like soybean oil that's used to fry a potato chip, or high fructose corn syrup that may be in a cookie, when you pick that up, you're not thinking, oh, this is corn, or oh, this is a soybean. So in that case, we see a lot of these consumer-facing companies that are not making product level claims. They're really talking more about their company, the corporate level, being good actors, good stewards of the planet. And so it just really depends on the product itself, on the industry that it's going into, and a lot depends on the company itself. I would say everybody's at different stages of their journey, but we went from, around 2020 with maybe one of our customers saying, hey, let's do something here, to now it's part of the conversation with nearly every customer. Whether we end up seeing a program or we're still trying to figure out what it would look like, the conversation is still happening.
That is so heartening to hear. And the fact that this is such a fast evolving conversation and such a fast growing space is why I wanted to talk to you today, Michelle. So thank you so much for your time and for your insights. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this specific episode. Thank you so much once again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.